If you are an oppressed group who are being denied rights that are ostensibly guaranteed by the Constitution, of course you're going to have particular critiques of the state. Of course you're going to push back. Of course you're going to organize and do things that are disruptive. How else, after all, are you going to gain this equality that you're ostensibly afforded? And so that constitutive necessity to challenge one's position makes you subversive, right? You get particular privileges and entitlements, which is actually just less oppression through the Black scare, right? If you distance yourself from Black people, if you don't care about civil rights, you will have particular privileges and entitlements that Black people don't have. And so comparatively, you'll live a better life. But the red scare is the stick, because if you get too uppity, if you do too much to organize for your rights, if you challenge the ruling class too much, if you join with Black workers or other racialized workers, you'll be called a communist and thereby punished.
I think you're not the person who coined the term racial capitalism, but that's what the article was about. You made an attempt to describe the entire capitalist structure under which imperialist capitalist structure under which we're operating. So, can you talk a little bit about how you came about doing this work, what inspired you to do it, and how you came about theorizing this concept?
I mean, I think in graduate school, my dissertation was about the intersections of anti-communism slash anti-radicalism and anti-blackness. And I was looking at kind of the level of the state, sort of the level of the university, but then also Black studies as a field. And my PhD is in African diaspora studies or Black studies. And that question emanated from my wanting to understand why there weren't very many political economists in Black studies, like why I was kind of overdetermined by cultural studies in my perspective, especially, or not overdetermined, but sort of codified through cultural studies by the time that I was getting my PhD, because it hadn't always been like that. And as I was doing that research to answer that question, a professor named Eula Taylor gave me Eric McDuffie's book, Sojourning for Freedom. And I read that book and I was like, and that book probably was the book that kind of changed my life. I was like, oh, Black communists. I had known about Black Marxist thought. Like my dissertation advisor is a Marxist adjacent or kind of dependency theorist, Guyanese. And so I was familiar with like Marxism, but that book, specifically the Communist Party, and Black people in the Communist Party and the Negro question and these types of things really started to animate my work much more. I didn't use the term racial capitalism, or maybe I briefly mentioned it in my dissertation, but to me, the way to understand why it is that the US had such hostility toward Black people and radicals and why those things were mutually constitutive is because we live in a society that's simultaneously racialized and capitalist. So racial capitalism was a useful framework. As I moved through sort of the development of my own understanding, Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism, which is where sort of most people come across the term, was less useful to me than the South African coining the South African sort of approach to racial capitalism, which I actually learned about through Peter James Hudson, who had written a piece for, I want to say, Boston Review, where he talked about this South African genealogy that I was unfamiliar with. And then, of course, the work of Oliver Cox. And so my interest in the ways that capitalism is constitutively rooted in racial hierarchy, but also the ways that racial hierarchy must be understood through relations of capitalist exploitation and accumulation is kind of like what is foundational to, or how I came to kind of the work that I do.
In the new book, in Black Scare, Red Scare, you seem to move away from wanting to describe it as racial capitalism, but you're actually calling it even racist capitalism in some places. One of the terms that even more strikingly, I think, like captures the spirit of what you're trying to describe is Wall Street imperialism. Before I even get to that, I want to start by talking about in the intro you cite W.B. Du Bois and how he draws a parallel between abolitionism and communism, and to state that right at the get-go from the intro, making no illusions about the fact that you are articulating a radical work. Like, so your interpretation is that or that Du Bois's interpretation is that abolitionism equals, in a sort of way, or communism in a sort of way equals abolitionism because both concern the liberation of the individual. So, do you think that like that's kind of like part of the thesis of what you were trying to do with Black Scare at Scare?
I wouldn't argue that communism is abolitionism. Communism is communism. And I just push back against that because like abolitionism in its current iteration is like its own thing. And often, in my perspective, oftentimes people call themselves abolitionists because they don't want to identify as a communist. So they might be, say, socialists
Hmm.
sometimes, but so I wouldn't conflate them. That quote was meant to illuminate the discursive strategies that construct threats that then rationalize and legitimate exploitation and violence. And so that quote, part of that quote is like the boy says, we invent witch words. And so the point that he's drawing is that because abolition challenged the racialized economic order at that particular historical moment, people who are abolitionists were called all of these terms, but then their violence against them was legitimated. And he said, now it's communists that because they advocate not only sort of economic redistribution, but also civil rights, also racial equality, they are considered to be scoundrels and subversives. And so I don't think that he's making that type of parallel, calling communism the new abolitionism. He's just simply drawing the parallel that these challenges to the methods of accumulation at these different historical moments construct subversive, construct dangers that are then become anathema to the state and thereby rationalized as targets of violence, incarceration, exclusion, and the like.
The targeting of the state on these terms or in these grounds, as especially like targeting of radicals as anti-nationals, and the sort of suppression of communism from the standpoint of it being not American,
Mm-hmm.
basically brings into the question of even the nationality of Black people overall, and that is something that you touch upon. So. Is that something that you can say that like because of that like anti-communism has the stripe of being a form of racial subjugation itself?
I wouldn't say that it's a form of racial subjugation, but rather an instrumentality of racial subjugation. So it's its own structure. It's its own sort of foundation of capitalist racist society, racial capitalist society, whatever you want to call it. But it is absolutely an instrumentality of racial repression and oppression, just as what I call anti-Black racial oppression or racial oppression writ large is an instrumentality and technique of anti-radicalism. I don't know. I don't think that the two are separable, but like I don't know that they're forms of each other, but whether rather sort of things that kind of like work together because of the ways that Black people are, irrespective of their political ideology, they're constitutively radical because their liberation would mean a fundamental challenge to the structure of society, just as fundamental economic redistribution is objectively radical, meaning uprooting, right? Because of the way that the United States never had a feudal period. Part of the theory of people like Harry Haywood and others is that the South is like they call it like a semi-feudal, like bourbon kind of organization, but the U.S. never had a feudal period as such in terms of the stages of history. It was always capitalist, always like colonial capitalist, and so because of that, and because that capitalism is fundamentally predicated on racial slavery and indigenous
Hmm.
genocide, those things just really can't be thought apart when we think about not only US capitalism, but also the function and the nature of US imperialism.
Especially given a recent tweet by, I think he's the CEO of Palantir or something, where he's saying somebody said, so Palantir was founded to kill communists, and then he says, yeah, what do you think we were founded for? So
Mm-hmm.
essentially, that like the design of the security state itself seems to be to target and kill communists and radicals. So it seems to be in the design of Wall Street imperialism, and he's like essentially a clear-cut figurehead of that. So, can you, first of all, describe how this Wall Street imperialist structure of political economy got defined and how it has changed over the different stages of like Reconstruction, and then post through Jim Crow and post civil rights, and now in the present day.
So Wall Street imperialism is a term again that's used by kind of like communist thinkers, and basically what they're arguing is that there is really a suturing between monopolies and the U.S. state. So at a particular historical moment, this is through like gunboat diplomacy. Peter James Hudson, his book, his dissertation was Dark Finance. What is it called? Now I had a baby. Oh, right here, Bankers and Empire. I remember nothing, no title since I had a baby, but this is a wonderful book. But it talks about the ways that Wall Street was really the catalyst for a lot of the US imperial projects starting in the 1890s, right? So the US rise is to its imperial, or it starts its takeoff to imperial hegemony around 1890. This is when it starts to gain its formal and informal colonies from the Philippines to Puerto Rico, Cuba, etc. And so much of its incursion into this imperialist project is at the behest of Wall Street. It's at the behest of corporations. And this persists, right? The relationship between the state and the private sector, as it were, monopoly kind of shifts so that you have the times like the in the 1930s, for example, when there's a bit more, and under like Teddy Roosevelt, theoretically, he was like, the trust buster, but what is that actually?
Hmm.
Anyway, so there's a different relationship between the state and the private sector, but there's always this revolving door, and always there is this understanding that on the one hand, US manifest destiny, Monroe Doctrine, and expansion. One of the reasons for this is that the US should have the unfettered ability to accumulate and to plunder. But then on the other hand, that the ways that US hegemony becomes consolidated is through these market relations. And so there's really a kind of co-constitutive relationship between the state and the private sector. And
Hmm.
that's not always the case. That's not always the drive. I mean, if we take up Lenin, right, with imperialism being the highest stage of capital, there is a drive, declining terms of trade and wanting to capture markets and the like. But that sort of indivisible relationship, or the way that the corporate interests drive the colonial project, is not the same globally. But it is the case objectively for the United States. In terms of the ways that it manifests at different points in history, if we take like the post World War II moment, for example, the US government has to compel private capital to be relatively more redistributive under like a Keynesian model, for example. We call this embedded liberalism. And the reason for this to happen is because of all, the context. There's decolonization, which is kind of the main factor. It's the Cold War, but also decolonization in the context of the Cold War, whereby they don't want the racialized world, which is the majority of the colonies, to go toward socialism or communism. And therefore, this sort of this modicum of redistribution through something like Keynesianism is necessary. And so there we see the government really sort of out front, in front of the corporations. If you look at the period of neoliberalism, this is when we kind of see the function of the state to be the defensive capital, if you will, right? And so the interests of the private sector become forefronted again. The state government welfareism becomes kind of anathema to the project of accumulation, to the way that the United States is able to sort of resolve its host of problems, starting with taking the dollar off the gold standard, blah, blah, blah. I've been reading this book, Neocolonialism by Jack Wattis, because he talks about the shift from colonialism to neocolonialism, and I'm trying to figure out where we are now. I think that the United States disposition of power signals perhaps a shift from neoliberalism to like a neo-fascism. The United States in particular, and I don't know that other countries have followed suit. People try to say Russia, but that's because people don't understand Russia. But anyways, like the US is shifting from a neo-colonial model back to a direct colonial model. And
Hmm.
that is something different. The Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective has a blog called My Pen is My Machete. And in our most recent volume, Percy Henson wrote an article where he talks about what's happening in the Caribbean and in Venezuela as colonialism.
Hmm.
And I was like, you mean neocolonialism? He's like, no, it's colonialism. And I think he does a fairly good job of explaining why that is to be. So to make a short story long, what shifts over time in different sort of epochs or cycles of accumulation, if you will, is the relationship between the state and private capital, but always to the end of sort of exporting whatever US led form of capital accumulation is most beneficial to like a ruling elite.
You perfectly brought this to the point of what is actually happening in Venezuela because, and I think like I really, it is both opportune and extremely tragic that we are at the point that we are. And it's opportune because I get to talk to you about it, and you are my like go-to for political takes, honestly, because your analysis, like I feel, really cuts to the core of the actual material forces that are operating here. And as you are pointing out, it does seem like a complete, like full on. Even would you say that, like, actually, I would ask this as a question. Would you say that this exceeds what you have even described as Wall Street imperialism into something it's straying into a different territory, or would you say that what is happening in Venezuela is contained within what you imagined or what you described as Wall Street imperialism in the book?
I think that US imperialism is Wall Street imperialism. This is a different enunciation of it. It's a different sort of manifestation of it. Private capital and the state have been fused to such a degree, especially under this regime. Not especially as if it didn't happen before, but like where we are in this stage of capitalism is so fused that my instinct is to say the sort of government, the US state, as it were, is sort of at the forefront of this colonial project. But given that it is a cabinet of billionaires, right, that the US is just, three weapons manufacturers stacked up in a trench coat, it's really hard. Like the government is essentially the private sector, especially if you look at somebody like Trump, who's a billionaire. Who knows? I don't know. He's simultaneously like a welfare king and a billionaire at the same time, which is just so crazy. But anyway, and so, but all of that to say, I do think it is still Wall Street imperialism because it is at the behest of both financial and manufacturing capital in the sense of like manufacturing weapons. But again, the relationship between like state and the private sector and sort of which entity is really driving, but also what are the techniques by which US domination is being imposed. Because there is a difference between neoliberalism and a Washington consensus and annexing Greenland. These are these are not the same project, and the question becomes, and again, this model is not being reproduced by other imperial powers, and so the question becomes, do they continue with this neoliberal model? But this juncture actually has been quite prevalent because the U.S. had very few formal colonies, right? So after 1945, the U.S. was supporting places like Britain and France and trying to hold on to their colonies, but at a particular moment, by maybe like 47, 48, certainly by 1950, the United States purported itself to be an anti-colonial power, even as these other sort of imperial powers are trying to hold on to their colonies because the U.S. wanted to export its own markets. And so I say that to say that this disjuncture between U.S. returning to like a more direct colonialism and other imperial powers holding on to a neo-colonial model, that's not that is par for the course. But the question is, what is to be done? Because what else is happening simultaneously, not unlike the Marshall Plan, is that places like the EU are being turned into vassal states effectively. This is all still in process. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So again, to make a short story long, all US imperialism is Wall Street imperialism. It's just a matter of how does it manifest?
One of the ways in which in the domestic area where Wall Street imperialism manifests is in the what you describe as the super exploitation of black people or black labor to turn a super profit. And you also describe the workers, and I don't think this just like is limited to up to the era of slavery and post emancipation, like even workers afterwards. The description that you're giving is subproletarian.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that, and there's an interesting juxtaposition here with respect to migrant workers who are also always like kept in opposition to especially African American workers throughout history. So that's something that you've discussed in the book. So can you talk about how you describe especially Black workers as subproletarian and how they interact with different working classes in the US and under this Wall Street imperialism?
I talk about the structural location of blackness and then like black people as a sub proletariat. And part of what I'm trying to work out there is that the condition of black people is not reducible to race, right? I.e., like an Afro pessimist argument, but it's not reducible to class, even though there is both an internal and an external class relationship, i.e., like Marxism is something else. And it has to do with, in that article you mentioned, and I think maybe in this book, I talk about this relationship of value minus worth, which is it's a sort of abstract concept, but it's also like black people are simultaneously essential, but kind of they're essential to this US project, but also superfluous or excess at the same time. And this is it's a aporia, it's an irresolvable contradiction. And I think that in each sort of, again, era or phase of accumulation in the US, there's always that, they called it the Negro question or whatever. Like there's always this, like, how do black people fit into this? What is to be done with them? And so the concept of super exploitation, the reason why I talk about super exploitation and expropriation is that super exploitation is an economic relationship. So exploitation and economic relationship. Expropriation is not simply an economic relationship. And so part of what I am trying to think through is that it's not just a labor theory of value, as it were. There's also forms of valuation and devaluation that are essential to not only accumulation, but also how black people are positioned. That's what I'm trying to work out. I don't know that I have it fully resolved, but I think, you could anecdotally, you could see it happen, right? Like, so there's a reason why it's predominantly black people in the in hyper incarceration, in the system of hyper incarceration, and the prison industrial complex. Most people talk about slavery and labor, but it's also a form of disaccumulation. It's a way of taking value out of the economy through the function of warehousing. So it's not exclusively black people, but we can think about, not unlike Haiti as the sort of imperial laboratory, we can think about black people as a never ending sort of laboratory of, or Palestinians really, like what is the sort of rate of oppression, to use the term that South African scholar uses, but what is the sort of rate of oppression that can be applied to black people to extract the most value possible in terms of labor, but also in terms of, things like housing. Like we don't often think about redlining. We think about the social impact or the political impact or something like redlining, but that is an economic relationship, right? The fact that you give people extremely terrible housing for exorbitant rent, that is a form of extraction. That's the economic relationship as well as a social, and it that is foundational to the sort of the social positioning. And the way that, I guess the easy way to say how black labor, foundational black American labor, relates to like other forms of labor is that they're not niggas. Like whatever it is that they do, there's always that recourse to be like, well, at least I'm not that, right? One really cannot say that other, like, Mexican labor is treated better than black people, because there's like all sorts of all sorts of things that coalesce. But the sort of the endemic and sort of kind of just instinctual way that blackness and black workers are continually devalued, that's just, it's not to say that other groups don't experience it, like, the Chinese Exclusion Act and others, all these other things, but it is something that is constitutive of the black experience. And there's no resolution to it other than like upending this system, right? So there'll be no story that's like white immigrant stories, or even to a certain extent Asian immigrant stories. This is not going to happen for black Americans.
It is like, I mean, interesting that they're pitting immigrants against each other more explicitly now I mean, like right now we're talking through the whole almost like terrorizing of Somali immigrants that is happening,
Mm-hmm.
which is a doubly, it's both a black issue and an immigration issue. There's like
And
a
religious. They're the worst of the worst. They're Muslim by and large. Not all Somalis are Muslim, but by and large, they are Muslims, which the US hates. They are Black and they are an immigrant population. And they're highly visible in terms of where they're concentrated, which is primarily in the Twin Cities. There are other places too, but primarily there, which I lived in Minnesota for 5 years. I don't know. When I taught at Carleton College, and like that is a white place. That is like the North, it's like the Scandinavia. Within there's like this very visible black population. So yeah, they are all the things the US is like, hell no. So yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting that like while you're at once locating blackness and the issues that pertains to blackness as like in a category that is separate from race, class, and caste, and you were important to point out and it said I don't want to open another can of worms, but like
Mm-hmm.
I forget the last name of this person, Isabel something, who wrote
Wilkerson.
this. Well,
Boo. Fucking
right.
terrible. Hated it. Anyway.
Yeah, so try to attempt this classification of blackness and the issues that pertain to blackness as a caste-based problem, and you locate it as separate. But at the same time, it must be noted that you are pointing out not only that radical leaders often are of immigrant descent, like they're from the Caribbean, a lot of them, including Marcus Garvey, who is not, and that's the second category where he's not a communist, not a radical in that sense, but is also a nationalist, a black
Mm-hmm.
nationalist, and he's also treated the same way, which is also kind of part of your analysis that by virtue of being treated the same way by the state as anti-national, black nationalism, the black struggle becomes equated to a form of overthrowing of the state or a communist revolution
Mm-hmm.
in that sense. But you're also like kind of pointing out that immigrants are playing a central role, both as being black immigrants and obviously now it can be tied to Palestinian immigrants being attacked for just like advocating against the genocide, just being deported and criminalized. So to tie it all together, like you're able to point out that the acts such as sedition and anti-national kind of acts have been used historically both against black leaders as well as and now like they're being used against um, immigrants of various stripes. So can you draw the line of continuity between the two?
I mean, the simplest way to explain it is that if you look at like the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act of 1917 and 18, if you look at the McCarran Act, the Smith Act of 1940, the McCarran Act of 1950, all of these things are about ideas. They're about many other things, but part of what they are targeting is ideas, and ideas become actions. They're challenging or they are criminalizing those who challenge the organization and the pedagogy, the approach of the state. And so this is why, for example, if it is that you are protesting, genocide in Palestine, and the US is invested in funding and sort of integral to that genocide, then effectively you are not only challenging US foreign policy, you're challenging the US state as such, even if it's just through ideas, even if it is through ostensibly protected civil rights like freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. What these kind of anti sedition or anti subversive forms of legislation do is abrogate rights that are ostensibly afforded to citizens or even residents of the country. And by and large, those are like racial and political minorities. This is kind of like the linkage between them. It is not that the Smith Act only targets Black people, but it makes legislation such as that make them particularly susceptible to forms of surveillance and incrimination and harassment. Because imagine that you don't even have to imagine, like if you are an oppressed group, who are being denied rights that are ostensibly guaranteed by the Constitution, of course you're going to have particular critiques of the state. Of course you're going to push back. Of course you're going to organize and do things that are disruptive. How else, after all, are you going to gain this equality that you're ostensibly afforded? And so that constitutive necessity to challenge one's position makes you subversive, right? And so there's different ways that this is repression is a key way that this is challenged. But of course, there's also co-optation. There's also
Mm,
forms of incorporation that happen that are really important in order to obfuscate the duration and intensity of the repression. Like you have to have a few chips in the cookie, as they say, right? Which is also part of the crumbling of this sort of this liberal fascist project is that, right, Trump et al, they are returning again to this white supremacist, this more nakedly white supremacist, less sort of it's much more stick than carrot.
this might be a case of me exposing my ignorance, but I haven't like read that much. But I've definitely read your book now, and I've read a few books of Gerald Horne's, Dr. Gerald Horne's, and I think the one thing that I noticed, which is kind of common or like similar between the two of you, is that like you are able to make these larger sweeping connections between macro, you know, political economic basically political economy observations and also make it like really pithy. And one of the things that you say is that black scare is the carrot and the red scare is the stick for the white working class. And this seems to be going on even now, where if you're woke, like the reason why even the Somali people they're going after is because like quite literally that they're voting Democrat. There's no other reason, if you really think about it. If you're woke, then you're seen as like not American enough, and they're doing this so nakedly. So that's something that you seem to have observed in this statement captures, which is that the black scare is like a carrot and the red scare is like a stick for the white working class. So can you speak about that and what you were going for with it?
You get particular privileges and entitlements, which is actually just less oppression through the black scare, right? If you distance yourself from black people, if you don't care about civil rights, you're good. Like you will have particular privileges and entitlements that black people don't have. And so comparatively, you'll live a better life. But the red scare is the stick because if you get too uppity, if you do too much to organize for your rights, if you challenge, the ruling class too much, then you're going to be red baited and you're going to be punished and disciplined. And also, if you join with black workers or other racialized workers, you'll be called a communist and thereby punished. And so the black scare is an incentive to reproduce the status quo. And the red scare is a warning that if you're too radical, if you defy this idea of true Americanism too much, then you will be punished. And so, and these things kind of work together.
One of the cases that we talked about is a Somali people scare. Quite literally, we're talking about someone who talked about eating cats and dogs and stuff like that, which is, and
Oh, that was
again, like this.
Haitians. You're being racist. You're confusing the
No, no,
Haitians
no.
and the Somalis. I'm kidding.
Right. No,
Yeah,
of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. You are right.
it was the
Damn,
Haitians.
that is correct. Like so they did like get into the level of doing both Haitian refugees, Somali people. So that's like again, it contains both dimensions of immigrant and like racial scare. So is this like again to bring it back to the question of who is considered a real American? Is this just like part of the nationalist project, and therefore the only way to oppose this is like a nationalist struggle, which kind of again like when I read your book, I have to say I couldn't unsee the parallels between what the US is doing to black people and Native Americans with what Israelis are doing to Palestinians. It is being enacted right in front of our eyes by the Israeli people, and it's as it's happening, it seems almost like your book is like giving a flashback of what has already happened in the US. So can you talk about that? Can you draw the parallels to this as like a settler colonial project, where like literally the map has grown more and more with time, and now it's trying to grow even more.
Obviously, like the indigenous question, or the indigenous realities here are the direct parallel to the question, what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine writ large, because that is the sort of foundational dispossession. It's like somebody came and was like, we're going to be here now. We are going to dispossess you by any means. What's happening now in Palestine is probably more parallel to what was happening maybe in the 1800s to Native American people. So like you have to see where you are in the dialectic, as it were, right? Where you are in the colonial project. But it applies to Black people too. And again, thinking about this temporally, so the era of lynching and just like outright murder, a particular form of genocide, matches up with the kind of attempt to literally exterminate Palestinians. And just as an aside, part of what I've since October 7th, so people really didn't start talking about genocide in kind of a generalized way until after October 7th. And part of what I've tried to insist is that this is just a war intensified genocide, because in my book, I write about the We Charge Genocide petition. And part
Mm,
of what they are conveying is that genocide is not extermination. It is the attempt to eradicate or to just oppress or reduce a population in whole or in part. And if we only think of genocide through the sort of naked barbarism that's been happening, that direct violence, then you miss all of the quotidian and everyday forms of reducing Palestinian people to bare life, to use like the term of Agamben. But like, and that is also genocide. The other thing that I wanted to say too is that and so thinking about this as it's not just a nationalist project, it's an imperialist project, because Somalis aren't being attacked simply because they're Democrats. The US has been bombing Somalia for
mm.
decades. And now there's this whole Somaliland question. You'll notice that also, as the aggression against Venezuela has picked up, so too has the demonization of Venezuelan migrants here. Because remember, there was like the Tren de Agua gangs and all that other bullshit. So we also have to see the ways that the U.S. incursions abroad and sort of so-called foreign policy projects, also, they have a domestic arm. And that domestic arm tends to be vitriol and oppression and repression of the migrants who are here, despite the fact that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the migrants or the diasporas here are reactionary. And that has to do
Mm.
with a number of things, especially when they come from the socialist states, because, these are generally the people who got expropriated or whatever, right? Again, that's not always the case, but we see this manifesting. Look at the people who are like, believe Venezuelans. If you're not Venezuelan, shut up, and all this other bullshit. The diaspora, it's true with the Haitian much of the Haitian diaspora. Of course, the Miami Cubans are their own thing, Venezuelans. So we also have to take that into account.
You are either part of the settler colonial project
Mm-hmm.
of the map increasing in size, or you're part of the people who get genocided effectively. And I don't know if it's an
Mm-hmm.
oversimplification, but it does seem like, you are making a pretty persuasive case for the fact that the black struggle in the US is not a struggle for representation, but a national liberation movement, or a struggle, which, I would like to ask, like, what sort of dimensions do you think it would take in your vision? Because clearly, the way that it's being carried out right now is it's like completely whittled down version of, like, not even like Black Panther militancy, of having like defending yourself, etc. But it's more just like electing a representative and hoping for the best, and those representatives also get like flushed out the moment, like Jamal Bowman or Cody Bush, and so that's like the most that seems to be possible from what I understand. And I don't just want to view it from an ideological lens. Like, it seems like a Marxist Leninist sort of revolution is the only way out of this sort of moment, or this sort of occupation, if you will. So what does that look like? We know what that looks like in Palestine, in Gaza. But what does it look like here, and how can this effectively, realistically be carried out?
I'm of a few minds about this. One, it is so I am sympathetic to like the black belt thesis or the Republic of New Africa, right? So I think that the Black struggle has to be a struggle for self-determination, period, not incorporation or inclusion into some sort of American project. However, this is not our land. This is indigenous land. There is
Hmm.
something to be said about, there's a lot of land, you know, there's not, that many Black people. So anyway, so there's something to be said about like the negotiations that need to happen between indigenous folks and Black Americans who I don't, there's all, I feel like indigenous scholars they're all over the place on this about whether or not Black people are settlers. Mm, my what does this jail call them? Involuntary denizens. So it's like, I mean, of course, there's waves of immigration after transatlantic enslavement, but like our presence here, like we were dragged here, and so I just think that it's a different category, right? And so I do believe that there needs to be a project. I'm sympathetic to a project of self-determination here. I am also a Pan-Africanist. And so I do think that the broader fight is for the liberation of the African continent. And if not a return project, I do believe that the homeland, the stronger that one's homeland is, the better position one has wherever you're located. It's a difficult question because Africa is a continent. Black people are from many places, although, majority, Bada of Biafra, Bada of Benin, like typically is where the majority of enslaved African people came from. But I think, whatever it is, it cannot be a representation project. Like, that's just not going to happen. Like, there's no way, you know, Malcolm X has been integrating into a burning house, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just no way to be self-determining by trying to, even if it's like trying to change from within or whatever. It's simply negotiating the terms of your immiseration, like at a particular level. And so, if we had a Black president of the United States, and the conditions of Black people were not Black people were not liberated, then that should tell people everything that they need to know about integration into the system. And so, but all of that to say, like, I don't know. There are Black people here who don't even think they're African. So there, at times, I think that Black people are the most potentially revolutionary class. At other times, I feel like internal colonialism was successful because these handkerchief hit. I don't know. So I'm not sure, but I do think that self determination needs to be the central drive of whatever organizing and liberatory project we have.
Do you think that someone who is not interested in this struggle for self-determination is effectively, kind of acting against the interests of Black liberation, especially if they're, Black leaders and public figures and so on who are effectively out there? There are people who are, I don't know if there were any Black people who were saying this, but like Christine Amanpour was like congratulating the Venezuela, the capture of the kidnapping of Maduro, and like what do you have to say about someone who doesn't believe in this radical revolutionary perspective? Would you say that that's like a person who is effectively against Black liberation?
And that's the majority of Black people in any given situation. It is a tiny percentage of people who are radical. Now, historically, Black people have been more radical than other groups because of being anti-racist. Most people are not Marxist Leninists, whether or not people believe in a project of self-determination. If they are against the project of Black liberation, that depends on if these are people who are enemies or people with whom we deeply disagree. If these are people who will crush any sort of way, any movement for self-determination, and who are like Americans, who see themselves as American and part of the American project, then yes, they are detrimental. People with whom we disagree are people who are, the US is the most highly propagandized nation in the world. Black people are not excluded or exempted from that. And in fact, can be much more susceptible if it is that you're trying to, like, you just want to, you've been down so long, you don't know how to get up. You're just trying to improve your conditions. And so if it is that these are just people with whom we deeply disagree, who lack a sort of revolutionary optimism, then I don't think that they're enemies, and therefore there is a level of sort of grace and cooperation that should be extended. Failure to believe in a project of self-determination is as much a failure of the left and our inability to win people to this position as it is anybody else. Why is it that like the manosphere or like ADOS or other sort of reactionary and gun that they be trying to drag me already, but like why is it that these reactionary movements are so attractive? And why is it that radical or revolutionary movements, if we want to even call it that, we barely have a movement, but why is it that these positions are not? That's something that we need to figure out, right? That's work. That's work that has to be done. You can't just assume and then condemn people for not having a particular perspective if you haven't done the organizing, the painstaking organizing and like people centered work to democratize that position.
A third thing that happens is the co-optation of especially radical rhetoric without much radical action, and especially the academy at the academy is to largely blame for this. And there's a lot of not just black, but a lot of ethnic intellectuals. Post October 7 has like really revealed who's who, because the only ones who really stake their careers and professions, it's become very clear. And like I'm pretty sure you would have had your challenges articulating your positions on Palestine and related issues. And even now, yesterday, there was a protester who got arrested for protesting Maduro on TV in a sort of comical way. So, in what ways does the academy, incentivize especially ethnic black and other ethnic intellectuals into this co-optation of radical struggle without any meaningful action? And how do you, especially as an intellectual who is involved in radical politics, sidestep this?
You know, I have debates about this all the time. I do not think academia is uniquely reactionary in that way. It is any professional classes. The journalists are backward, the lawyers, and maybe it's like if you have to get a professional degree, but even the nonprofit sector, hell, even movement spaces, it's the same type because of there's this kind of like perhaps cross pollination or like neoliberalization. No kind of sector is immune. But I think that it is to be expected that academia would produce people who are reactionary because academia is the intellectual arm of the state, and its function is class reproduction. That's also why there's an attack on higher education, even as it is nowhere near radical. And so academia, the university is doing what it is supposed to do in the context of this country, right? The function and role that it plays elsewhere is a different matter entirely, sort of. But a lot of these universities elsewhere are also colonial universities, right? They're meant to reproduce like a colonial comprador class. We have to be, whatever the institution is, we have to be in these institutions, but not of them to the best of our
Mm.
ability. We're always going to be entrapped. I always quote Walter Rodney when he said, intellectuals are enemies of the people until proven otherwise.
Hmm.
I got more understanding of that reading this book on neocolonialism because it talked about how there was a shift when there's a shift to the sort of neocolonial approach to the global south. There was also a shift from sort of courting and co-opting like traditional leaders and pre-capitalist elites to number one, the cultivation and creation of petty capitalists, but also a turn to like intellectuals and artists and other and a sort of a cultural imperialism, if you will. To me, that gives even more credence to what he was saying because of the ways that neocolonialism infuses the role of the intellectual. You're an enemy until proven otherwise. And so our historical task in academia is to prove otherwise, if you will, to plunder these universities of the resources to redistribute and democratize them to the best of our ability. As I always say too, like we have to believe our own analysis. We talk so much about how these are racist, colonial, neoliberal, whatever institutions. And then when you're treated with racism or sexism or as a colonized person, you feel affronted because somehow you think that you should have transcended that by virtue of meritocracy or whatever. So you don't believe your own analysis, right? it's one thing to be affronted because you're a human being and you deserve to be treated with respect. It's quite another to feel like even I am being treated this way. Of course you are. You wrote a whole fucking book about this, right? You do the work that you can do. You have a grounding and a rootedness outside of the institution. You wage struggle where you are. Walter Rodney also said this, that insofar as we're in the university, we wage struggle here, whether it's around labor, how do we just treat people, how do we treat our students, how do we treat our colleagues, how do we treat contingent faculty, what are we doing with the privilege and access that we have as academics and intellectuals. So you know you can't, the universe will never be decolonized. That's just dumb. Like that's just, it's just not real. But as I've also said previously, you can make decolonial moves within academia, and that really starts with ethics. How do you relate to yourself? How do you relate to other people? And how do you relate to this work? What do you see as your historical task? What and who are you accountable to? And I don't mean accountability in this stupid social media sense where fucking randoms who don't know you think they can hold you accountable. Like, what the fuck? That's dumb. But who are you actually accountable to? Like, who are you responsible to? That's the best we can do in this epoch, in this formation. We're better off doing that than trying to cosplay revolutions. Like if you're not gonna bust a grape in a fruit fight, don't pretend that you are, because then you're just, that's throwing dirt in the eyes of the people.